Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook. And with me today is Ms. Diane Portnoy, who is the president, founder, and CEO of the Immigrant Learning Center. And she, along with Barry Portnoy and Charlie Riggs, edited a book entitled Immigrant Struggles, Immigrant Gifts. This is a product of the Immigrant Learning Center, and so I think I'd like to start there. But Ms. Portnoy, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be with you today, John.
Now, you have this Immigrant Learning Center located in Massachusetts that was founded in 92.
Yes.
And it's a nonprofit adult learning center that teaches immigrants English, and you have succeeded in teaching 7,000 immigrants from 109 countries English.
Actually, we've taught over 7,500 immigrants from 118 countries so far since we've opened.
Wow, so more has been done since the book was printed.
Yes.
And your parents were Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust, and you were
Correct.
Born in East Germany, right?
Correct. My parents were Holocaust survivors. They actually lost their entire families during World War II. When I was born a year after the war ended in East Germany under Russian jurisdiction, and the three of us had to escape. It's quite a story of how my parents actually escaped from East Germany into the American zone, where we lived for 3.5 years. And when the United States passed the Displaced Persons Act, where they granted many more visas for those that were displaced during World War II, it was a lottery system. And I consider ourselves very lucky. We were one of those chosen to come to the United States, and we came on a converted battleship. Men on one side of the boat, women and children on the other. And we came through Ellis Island. And I became so sick that when we got to Ellis Island, I was quarantined with my mother for over a week. But the good news is we got out. Obviously, I got better. And we settled in Massachusetts. And it is an immigrant story. The first years of my life, I grew up in an immigrant community. We did not speak English, but obviously I learned English by going to school. I don't know how my parents learned, but they somehow did. There were no free schools, and there certainly was no money to pay to go to school. But somehow they learned, they got jobs, they worked hard, they did everything they could, and they were so happy to be here, as were all their friends, all the people I knew. I can still remember the day they became citizens, 5 years after we came to this country. I went with them. I was about 8.5, 9 years old, and I went with them to that swearing-in ceremony. And I can still remember how excited, happy, and the tears when they became citizens. And then about 6 months later, I went to get my citizenship papers. I still have those papers with my picture, a 9-year-old little girl with long braids. So I know what it means firsthand to be an immigrant, to settle in this country, and then I see it every day at the school, what becoming an American means to these people, how much they treasure and value it, and how hard they work. So I see that side. That's what I see. I call it an entrepreneurial spirit, because to leave everything you know, to leave friends and family, your culture, everything, and to start over again, to come to a new country is not easy. It takes a tremendous amount of strength, bravery, whatever it does, and resilience, and to start over again, and to find, for them to find freedom, to find economic opportunity and hope. I think I've so many times heard our students say over and over again, for the first time in our lives, we go to bed at night and we're not afraid for our children. Or for the first time in my life, I can practice the religion that we practice. Or I have hope for the future, for my future, or for my children's future. This is a very, very special country, John.
It is, and there's a lot that it has going for it. The sad thing to me is how often the same pattern is repeated with immigrants, and we are a nation of immigrants.
Exactly.
You mentioned that people that didn't know what you did for a living told you from time to time about the problem with immigrants, and they were job stealers and welfare abusers, and they brought disease and all of that. And, of course, having gone through it yourself, you probably had some interesting answers. But as we look through the stories, and I was taken by even the Europeans that I didn't know had suffered so much. Everything from the Know Nothing Party, which was an anti-Catholic, anti-Irish party, and the murder of striking coal miners, and the Chinese who came in to help build the railroads. And every group of immigrants seems to go through this same pattern of abuse.
Yeah, it's an interesting pattern. It seems that every immigrant group that has come into the country in one way or another has had to deal with this nativism, this anti-immigrant sentiment, this rhetoric. You'll find that except for the first 60 years of the country, when the country was first founded, immigrants were very, very welcomed. And after the Civil War, immigrants were very, very welcome because we needed immigrants after the Civil War to build the country, to build the railroads, to build the canals. But generally, every immigrant group has had to deal with what I call nativism. And as you were saying, they were seen as being, they would be as being inferior.
Mm-hmm.
Italians, for example, were seen as being quote-unquote dirty, of course, or as being criminals. The Irish and the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party, the Irish had to deal, for example, with a book that about what went on with nuns and the sexual practices that went on with nuns, which of course were not true. What Jews had to deal with, the elders of Zion, that they were out to take over the capitalist system, that sort of thing. So all the old prejudices kept coming up and up. Eastern Europeans, the massacre in Pennsylvania, the coal miners. The coal miners were objecting to the fact that they would have to walk an extra mile with their mules to the coal mines, and they were striking peacefully. I mean, they were not at all belligerent, and a number of them were killed, and many were wounded. So somehow, maybe it was because of the economy at the time, but many of them were seen as dangerous, although they weren't, as you said, they are the ones that built the nation. And the other thing that people don't realize is that immigrants are entrepreneurs. They start businesses. They are twice as likely to start a small business as the native-born. I know you have many, for example, Mexicans that live in your area, Brownsville. And people, I don't think, realize that Mexicans tend to start about 50,000 small businesses a month.
Wow.
Yes, as entrepreneurs. They are also very hard workers. They have strong family values. I recently read a newspaper article about how they're needed on farms, and dairy farms particularly. The dairy farmers are looking for them, for their skills.
You see this pattern again. I'm sorry.
The same pattern over and over again.
You talked about the new immigrants working at the margins of American life as peddlers and domestics and factory workers and miners and itinerant laborers, and that sounds so much like the Tex-Mex story down here. And the thing that gets to me is just that they're doing these jobs that we needed doing, and especially when the country was expanding and growing during the Industrial Revolution, they were hungry for labor, and so we would recruit them, and we would find ways to encourage them. The military service of immigrants was encouraged, which was a fast track to citizenship, which of course is still true today too.
Yeah,
so,
a little bit. Yeah, but as you were talking about, for example, at that time when we needed them after the Civil War, Michigan would hand out free land. South Carolina would offer immigrants a 5-year tax exemption on real estate purchases. I mean, Texas would send out agents abroad to recruit immigrants. Germans and British and the Irish, Scandinavians, French, Canadians, they were all warmly welcomed at that time because of, like I said previously, they were so needed to build the railroads. Steamship companies and state governments all very, very actively recruited immigrants, to meet the very, very voracious labor needs, of an expanding industrial economy and transcontinental railroad.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act that started in 1882. And you started having in 1894, the Immigration Restriction League started. And by 1911, you had the Dillingham Commission report that said that immigrants from South and Eastern Europe were intellectually and racially inferior.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that was a reaction to the 20 million immigrants that came in between 1880 and 1920 from Eastern Europe, Jews, Russians, Italians, Greeks, from the Caribbean and the Middle East. So there was always this give and take. But I keep saying we are a nation of immigrants. Most people out there are descendants of immigrants. It's your parents, your grandparents, your great-great-grandparents, and so forth that went through this experience.
Mm-hmm. The various events of history seem to mark the ebb and flow and be part of the impetus for what changed from time to time. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese Gentleman's Agreement, and stuff like that was going on. The Reed-Johnson Act of 24 defined policy for quite a time, but then the Great Depression, just like our recent recession, stemmed the tide of immigration on the south border anyway. The Great Depression was more powerful than any legal barrier, and at some point they deported 500,000 Mexican immigrants during that time.
When the economy controls so much, if the jobs aren't available, first of all, people aren't going to come here if there are no jobs here. And I think we see it a little bit today, too. Everything we read is that as the Mexican economy improves, not as many Mexicans are crossing the border to come to work in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
As well as from other countries. We are now actively recruiting, for example, we need high-skilled workers. So we are actively recruiting immigrants in the STEM areas, science, technology, math, in those areas. But we also need low-skilled workers. You can have all these, people that are very, very high-skilled and start high-tech companies. But there are all these other jobs that go with it. If you have these people that settle in a community, you also need the nannies. You need people that are going to clean houses. You need people that are going to cut grass. You're going to need people that are going to open the shops that these people shop in. So everything relates to everything else. And as the population declines in this country, as we have an elderly population, we do need immigrants to replenish that.
Mm-hmm. I was struck by so many things in here about the struggles, and of course the German immigrants at first were welcomed warmly until we got close to World War I.
Correct.
The law case Meyer versus Nebraska, where was fighting against for the right to continue to teach German, but I was laughing when German language got made fun of, and Americans began calling sauerkraut Liberty cabbage, and hamburger became Salisbury steak, and I thought of freedom fries when we got mad at the French.
Right.
Just
the Frankfurter became the hot dog.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It wasn't just German that was outlawed. It was all foreign languages for a while that became outlawed. When the Germans first settled in this country, when we first became a country, even Ben Franklin felt that there were too many Germans coming in.
Mm-hmm.
And then Germans were very welcomed for a while. And they, of course, brought a lot into the country, from the Statue of Liberty to universal elementary education, the concept of free legal aid. And there are very, very well-known Germans from many, many entrepreneurs, such as, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, Astor, I believe.
I think Frederick Louis Maytag was mentioned.
Right, Astor, Maytag, Singer was the son of German immigrants. Pfizer founded the pharmaceutical giant, all the beer companies.
Yes, so the Anheuser-Busch and Coors, we have to remember those folks. Pabst and
Miller,
Schlitz, those are all German names.
Yeah, Oscar Mayer, Heinz, Edmunds, those are all German names. Pulitzer in journalism. Mm-hmm. Certainly, engineers that helped build the Brooklyn Bridge.
Mm-hmm. And when you mention journalism, you have to add Thomas Nast, who fought Harper's Weekly, and H.L. Mencken, just an amazing. And that's the thing that blows me away in each chapter as I read it, is when we get to the gifts part.
Oh, yes.
After the struggles, how many folks have made such a difference. If we turn to the Irish, and the Irish really suffered, I think, more than unfair discrimination from the beginning. I guess it was one of those times when they were worried about taking jobs, mostly.
Yeah, they're taking jobs, and there were many riots, I think, anti-Irish and Catholic riots. There was in Boston in 1835, Philadelphia, 1844, St. Louis, 1854, Louisville, Kentucky, 1855, Coalfield riots, 1870s, it goes on and on. Even the Staten Island Hospital was burned down 1858, where Irish were quarantined. We tried to close parochial schools. People were afraid that the Pope would have too much control over things. And as I mentioned before, this publishing, the book was called The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk in 1836, and it was supposedly about a nun and the sexual activities that went on in a convent. Of course, it was proved false. Mm-hmm. And at that time, they were described as criminals and drunks, and everyone lived on welfare, as I said, controlled by the Pope. They were associated with the disease cholera. It was actually called the Irish disease. Mm. And the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, they did have a string of political victories, including the governor of Massachusetts, Henry Joseph Gardner. Mm-hmm. But it was not long-lived. It didn't last very long. And, of course, the Irish came to this country, like most immigrants, for economic reasons, the potato famine, or the Great Famine, of 1845 through 1852, which led to that huge influx and the tremendous poverty that went on in Ireland. And then you think of the contributions. It goes back to Andrew Jackson, who was elected in 1828. He was Irish. Mm-hmm.
George Meany, AFL-CIO,
yes,
and then, of course, Mary Harris Jones, the union organizer who became known as Mother Jones.
Right.
That's a huge name.
Mother Jones, that's right. Of course, Kennedy, the Kennedys. One of my favorite stories, of course, is a gentleman named Thomas Murray. Mm-hmm. And he was one of 12 children. And his father died when he was 9 years old. And so we quit school to light gas lamps in Albany, New York. He went on to own all the major electric companies in New York City. And he held as many patents, almost as many patents as Thomas Edison. So Edison invented the light bulb, but Murray invented things like sockets and fuse boxes, and switches and circuits, things like that. Yeah. And, you have stories like that over and over again. And, of course, in the film industry.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if people remember Maureen Sullivan, Gene Kelly, Grace Kelly, Spencer Tracy, Judy Garland.
Bing
Bing
Crosby. Yeah.
They're all descendants.
And directors. It wasn't John Ford.
Yes, I believe so, yes. And, of course, they're known for being in their organizing labor unions, things like that.
Now, the Whigs and the Republicans during the time when that was at its worst drove a lot of Irish into the Democratic Party.
Yeah, they are Democrats.
Because,
yes, they are. And of course, I'm in Massachusetts, so we're the Irish do have a history here.
Mm-hmm. And part of that was because of the temperance movement, which the Democrats weren't as big on as the Republicans and the Whigs.
Yes.
It is known that some Irish like to drink, so...
well, I think a lot of people like to drink. The Germans also like to drink. I mean, it's part of human nature.
Right. But even things like St. Patrick's Day are more celebrated in the U.S. than in Ireland today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we mentioned politics, we mentioned the Kennedys, but Eugene McCarthy, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, there were a number of people in politics.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a strong tradition that continues on, certainly.
The Italians had it bad because the folklore had everybody who was mafioso being Italian.
Oh, yeah, that's it. Italians, they're all criminals.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the story that we talk about in the book is something that happened in New Orleans in 1890, where a chief of police was shot and died. And before he died, he blamed, quote, unquote, the Dagos.
Mm-hmm.
So hundreds of Italians are rounded up, 19 were indicted, and 9 went to trial, but no one was convicted because they really didn't have strong enough evidence. And so it was considered a scandal. And so it was on March 14th, 1891, a mob of over 100 broke into the jail and hung 11 Italians. And many newspapers at the time okayed this act. And so Sicilians, if you look at New Orleans and Louisiana, many from of Italian descent, especially from Sicily, from Rome and South.
Mm-hmm.
And these people were described as sneaky and cowardly. And the Italians that came to live in New York City, that lived in the tenements, they were described as being very, very dirty. Why? Because they cooked with spices that were different. The smells were different, like garlic.
Mm-hmm.
And so to other people, it was described as strange foods, and so they were described as dirty.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how people were described. Also, they were considered, because of the color of their skin, as black, and that was also a problem. So they were greasers, and I apologize to every Italian out there. I hate using the words, but they were described as greasers and wops and dagos, guineas, things like that. Terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they were strong family values, talented musicians and artists, and brilliant in physics, in medicine, tremendous heroism in military service, also very active in the labor movement. Cheese industry in Wisconsin and Michigan was started by the Italians.
Mm-hmm.
So LaGuardia was an Italian.
Oh, if you start listening to Italian
Mario
names.
Cuomo, his son Andrew today, business, Lee Iacocca.
Mm-hmm. Joe DiMaggio, Rocky Marciano.
Oh, there you go, right.
Yogi
Sports,
Berra.
Absolutely.
Alan
Planters
Alda.
Peanut Company
Yeah.
was started by an Italian gentleman by the name of Amadeo Bici. He came to this country in 1888 at the age of 11. Little education, odd jobs, including a peanut stand. And then he discovered the process of roasting peanuts.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go.
So we've got Peanuts, and we've got Tony Bennett and Frank Sinatra.
There
and
you go,
we've got
right.
sports figures. And Alan Alda is one that I didn't realize he was Italian. Then Bernadette Peters,
right.
Sylvester Stallone, Bruce Springsteen, Madonna. Oh my gosh!
There you go. Thank you, and it goes on and on. Right.
This is an amazing chapter on them, and all those names at the end blew me away. But what really stuck with me is a statement at the very end of that chapter where it says, "Assimilation is a constant balancing act." And if that's not a theme of this book, I don't know what is.
Right. Well, we want people. I'd like to think we are a family of man, and we all take the best of everything, and we make America. We are Americans. At the Immigrant Learning Center, every year we host a citizenship swearing-in ceremony. And I look out at those people, and I always tell them, no matter where you're from, and whether you're old or young or rich or poor, male or female, it doesn't matter the color of your skin. Today, no matter what, you are an American. And there really is no other place in the world where you can say that. I can go to France and live there for 50 years, and I would never be considered a French woman.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could go to Italy and live there for 50 years. No one would ever consider me an Italian. But you can come to America and you become a citizen. You are an American, regardless of your history, regardless of your culture or the country you are from. You become a citizen, you are an American. And there are responsibilities that come with that. And we like to think that you bring the best of all these different cultures with you. And that makes us who we are.
Well, the chapter, each chapter is just chock full of interesting tidbits about this. The resounding themes of the prejudice and the violence that wells up in the fear in each case of what you euphemistically call the nativist movement.
Yes.
The resurgence of the Klan when they began to attack the Jews as well as the Catholics and the blacks. And, there's so much in the Jewish chapter remind me of how much contribution the Jews have made, and the same for the Greeks. But I want to touch just briefly, because we're in South Texas, I want to touch briefly on the Mexican chapter, which is still being written, of course.
Yes, that's still going, yes.
They've been ebbing and flowing for quite some time, but the latest round of anti-Mexican nativism has been since the 90s and going forward. For example, in California, Proposition 187.
Correct. That was in 1994, where they tried to bar the undocumented immigrants from public schools,
mm-hmm.
and also from all forms of tax-supported health care and other public social services. And, of course, Mexicans are seen as tax users, freeloaders, welfare recipients.
Mm-hmm. And yet they all pay taxes. They actually pay taxes at the state and federal level.
Absolutely. I have to tell you, even the undocumented pay taxes. If they're working, they pay taxes. Somehow and most of them will never see it. It goes into Social Security and the health system, and they will never see it.
Mm-hmm. There's something in here about, near the end of that chapter, about what a tragedy it is that an estimated 6.7 million undocumented must continue to live lives in the shadows, and the estimates run as high as 20 million depending on who you talk to. So we've got to,
Well, right now, in terms of the undocumented, the official number is 11 million.
Right, yeah.
Of those, how many are Mexicans? I don't know. They're talking that, I see all kinds of numbers. For example, they say about 25% of children under 18 have at least one immigrant parent. They say 39% of those are Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how that relates to how many of those 11 million undocumented are Mexican.
This is way too short a time period to talk about a book that's as rich as this one is. Unfortunately,
oh my goodness,
we're out of time.
Has it been a half an hour,
it
John?
has.
Oh, my goodness,
I'm
it's
sorry.
been such a pleasure.
I've been talking with editor Diane Portnoy. about a book called Immigrant Struggles, Immigrant Gifts by the Immigrant Learning Center, Incorporated. This is a good read. It's important to folks of every ethnic group and well worth your time. And if you've had the whitewashed, softened version of American history, you need to take a look at this book as well. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you that we're on 4 times a week now on KMBH, but if you don't catch those 4 broadcasts, we're also on the Facebook page, Good Books Radio. Thanks for listening.